All right, we are back in tutorial number, is it 4? I've been sitting in this chair for hours recording for you guys. You better watch every minute of it, like, comment, and subscribe, and also start using Domo Library. Here we're getting into, I think, the thing that everybody really wants to see, which is how do I use classes to interact with APIs in a way that kind of makes my life easier. Because using classes for classes' sake can just be confusing and frustrating, but I think it can also bring a lot of value to your code writing because it introduces a degree of consistency when I know that every response from my library that talks about a page is going to have the same field names, right? In some of Domo's APIs, and I'm not trying to make a dig, it's just a fact, sometimes the ID column is called ID. Sometimes it's called page ID. Sometimes it's called database ID, and then depending on what you were querying, the type, you'll know if it's a page ID or a card ID. When I use classes, if I have a class called Domo page, I know the ID column is always called ID. I know the name is always called title, which I always forget, but right, there's some consistency when I work with classes. Additionally, every page, I want to be able to, what's a better example? Every data set, I want to be able to start execution. I want to be able to enable PDP. I want to be able to have methods that do specific things for this class type, and I don't want to write my code 5, 8, 7 times. So by using a library of classes, I can simplify things. And we saw that in our first demo when we were looking at the full auth class, and we looked at extending the full auth class to handle Domo Jupyter, right? The real value wasn't until I got into my roots. Because when I got into my root for, in our case, update Jupyter file, I just had to pass in an auth object, and then my getData function knew how to handle. Actually, don't need this. I can get rid of that. I hope it still works. $200 response. Yeah, I don't have to think about authentication. My my class method or my root method just knows how to handle authentication because all of that is handled by the auth class. Okay, so how do I build a class? We already hinted at it in the first tutorial, but here we're going to take a look at building a Domo Jupyter content class and some of the associated methods, as well as a Domo Jupyter class, again, with associated methods. So you might say, well, why do I need one class for content and one class for like all of Domo Jupyter? Well, the content class is specific for interacting with one piece of content. My Domo Jupyter class will maybe do something like, I don't know, get all of my content. Or maybe I'll have a method that will map over all of my content and enable data flows. Or I don't know. But I have a separation between the individual object and another class that manages all of the objects. Okay, so Domo Jupyter content will have attributes name, folder, last modified, file type, and content. It will receive the Domo Jupyter full auth object. When I print it, I don't want it represented because I don't want to print my password, so I'll say representation equals false. The field is still there, sorry, the attribute is still there, it's just going to be invisible. Similarly, default export folder, I'm going to say the default is export. If I run a function like download content, I want it by default to go into a folder or a subfolder called export, just to make it easy to find. For Domo Jupyter content, how do I create a piece of content or an instance of the content class? I will use a class method called fromJSON. What does that do? The fromJSON class will receive an API response where the API will have the path, the name, last modified, file type, and so on, and it will do some stuff to it. It will parse the last modified text into a date time. It will parse object.getContent and just store it in something called content. So I can use the from JSON method again to introduce consistency. Maybe Domo has everything in, what's it called? Snake case. And I want everything to be written in, right? So I can, again, introduce consistency. It will always be called name, not display name, not title, name. Not folder, folder, not directory, not folder name, folder. I can use classes to introduce consistency. I can also use classes to say, hey, I would love to just have a function called export content. I run that function and it just does stuff for me. It handles my question of, ooh, do I need to make a directory? It handles the question of how do I download my content? And I always forget that I need to encode things as UTF-8. So if I write that into my class function, it just works. But where's the bit about interacting with APIs? Well, when you run export content, I assume you already have the content. So I don't actually need to interact with an API in order to export content that has been saved into the instance of the class. Now that said, if you want to update Domo Jupyter, if you want to update a document in Domo Jupyter, yeah, we need to interact with the API. Again, here's where it gets interesting. Well, how do I handle authentication? Don't worry about it. The auth class does that. Well, how do I know which URL to hit and all of that? Don't worry about it. The root function takes care of all of that. The only thing I care about for the class method is to say, well, how do I handle what folder things go to? Right? Because that has nothing to do with how the API works. That's just how Jay Wilson wants his library to behave and how I want you, the end user experience who's using my library. This is how I get to define what your experience feels like. We'll see an instance of the Domo Jupyter content class in a moment, but let's talk about a new class called Domo Jupyter, which again is the wrapper for all of things related to Domo Jupyter. Right now, there's only two methods. One method says, hey, you can't do anything unless you have a full auth object. So if you passed an auth object that has a password, and it is not an instance of Domo full auth, knowing me, that probably means it is just a Domo full auth instead of Domo Jupyter full auth. So let's convert it. How do you convert it? Well, we know what we need to pass. If you didn't pass those things, we'll raise an exception. Yeah, but Jay, what if I use token authentication? All right, fine. Then let me extend my init to say, if, how do you know if it's, I think it's just called developer token or something like that. Right, so if self.auth has an attribute called developer token, and it is not an instance of Domo Jupyter developer token, then raise the exception because we haven't really built this code yet. I can't run this code because I think I can. Maybe I can't. I don't know. For sure, this class doesn't exist. I don't know if that's going to error out, so we'll find out. Anyway, so that's my post init, which is what happens after I initialize an instance of Domo Jupyter. The class method I really care about, though, is get content. Get all of my content recursively, thank you very much. And so I have that function called get content recursive. Ooh, you know, it'd be clever. Is recursive type bool is equal to true. The default behavior will be to handle it this way. So we'll say if is recursive, then get my content recursively, and else our call will be to the non-recursive API root was get Domo content. And I guess we could pass a path be in root, but by default, we always expect it to be root. Okay. Then no matter what, take my res.response and convert it into Domo Jupyter content. How do I do that? Using the from JSON class method. Ooh, please don't fail. I would love to do that. Oh no, what did I do wrong? I need to spell wrong. Default argument. Default argument. Where? Close parentheses colon. Boy, if that's not the least helpful error message. Type string equals. Okay. Good. And error. Domo Jupyter full auth has no attribute developer token. Yeah. Okay, fine. Yeah, this doesn't work. So is it has attribute? Self.domo auth and has attribute developer token. I think that's how you're supposed to test. Attribute self.auth domo. That should, I believe, return a true or false. If it does it pass? Yes. Do I get content? It's doing what I hope it's doing. It's testing recursively. Good. Okay, so did it actually work recursively? To answer that question, what was it called? For content in Domo content. And remember, each of these is a instance of the Domo content class. We're going to print Domo content.name. And this should be recursive. And I know it's recursive because it has that field migrate demo. Oh, you know what? I don't want this to run recursive. I just want it to get the contents of that root folder. So I'm going to say is recursive equals false, right? What's happening under the covers? We're hitting a completely different API, and I know it because it broke. Why am I passing debug PRN? Small errors, a little bit annoying. Okay, so what I can do for get content, my class function, a lot of times I might want the option to return raw. Return raw, just give me the response get data, as opposed to converting it into a class object. And I like to build this into all of my code to both short circuit when things don't when things don't work, but also to give you a choice if you want to interact with the raw API response. So now I need to just pass is return raw equals true. Why didn't you? Am I out of my mind? Return raw is equal to true. So if return raw, return helps if you know all your words. What does Domo content currently look like? It has okay. Okay. So do do do. So then what I'll say is ls. And right, depending on the API, the content that I care about is in a different place. So content ls is equal to res.response in the recursive, whereas in the normal, it'll be content ls. I believe that is true. Return raw is equal to false. And then hopefully this is didn't throw an error. Okay, so this is a result from my recursive is false, and now we won't see migrate demo in the list. It's much shorter because again, it just mapped over the first root folder instead of going recursively. What did we learn? We learned not to make changes to code on the fly. Um, what we learned is we learned how to create classes. And again, classes allow me to shape your experience with my library. I can create classes that introduce a bit of consistency or conform the response of an API, right? One Domo API might call it name, the other one might call it display name, but my class will always have the attribute name. We saw that I can still use post init to alter the behavior of data class after it initializes. We used class method to return an instance of the object, an instance of the class. In this case, I always in my code use from JSON to hit an API and return the response from that API as a instance of a class. We saw that we can change how the API gives us data back. So I can say, ooh, I want this to be a date, for example. Similarly, I can simplify some of my code writing to say, ooh, I would like to have a method that just handles downloading my content and storing it into a folder and handling all of the stuff around exporting files. That can be done. And then we looked at Domo Jupyter as a wrapper for returning all of the content. We looked at, again, using post init to handle auth conversion if necessary. And then we looked at using get content, which seems very similar to get content recursive or my root function get Jupyter content. But again, now I can have some more logic and like say, okay, the user gets to massage it a little bit. I have a is recursive Boolean that will literally hit two different APIs. Now think about all of the code that has been written that wraps up get content recursive and get Jupyter content. If I had all of that here in this class method, it would be a gnarly, ugly function that would be hard to debug, hard to maintain. But by splitting it into two separate roots, I can have easier testing. I can say, ooh, I just need to test and make sure get content recursive works. I need to test and make sure get Jupyter content works. So it makes my code a lot more maintainable to split it up. I also demoed how we can have return raw, which will allow me to short circuit my code and allow you to interact with the raw API response as opposed to interacting with the finished class object. And again, that's just a quality of life thing that I offer my users that are using the Domo library. Got two variations of getting content with is recursive equal to true and false. We looked at return raw. We know what debug API does, so that's great. I think I'm gonna skip downloading, but I promise it works. Did he just say that? No, fine. We'll just go through it real quick. Please work. I'm not recording this again. So I'm going to take the first item from Domo DJ content, which is the myturtledemo.txt. Okay. And let's see. So we're going to call that test content. Let's start by printing what class test content is. Test content is of class Domo Jupyter content. Yeah, we knew that. Let's also just take a look at what test content looks like. Test content has a name. Oh, it's the first, not the 0th. That's fine. What is in untitled? Untitled 1. Please don't have my username and password. Oh, it's empty. Okay, so it's empty. I can see this is the last time it was modified back in 2022. I can see it's of type file. The content is none. Oh, I should have just seen that from where I printed. And we're going to have an export button. Okay, so let's do this. Let's do test content. And we are going to set the value of content to no more. And then I'm going to print it. Content. Okay, so now as I print test content, the content is almost done, but I actually haven't updated it yet. So let me go ahead and uncomment this, and we're going to run the function called update, and of course it doesn't work the first time. I refuse to believe that it is because I don't have a value. Be sure it's not the user token. That is still the correct token. So, what did I do wrong? Let's pass in debug API. See what happened. So, content almost done. Text is. Ooh, the path is a lie. Path is a lie. Okay, so what happened is the method, or how I pass the, no, I need to look for update. JSON, export folder, update method. Aha, here. So content path is equal to self.folder, and self.folder is an empty string, and self.name. So let's do one more if statement. So we'll say if the length of self.folder is greater, then run this code. So if the length of self.folder is greater than 0, then this is appropriate. Else, content path. I believe that is correct. I need to get my content again to make sure it worked. And try to send it. Response is 200. What did we update? We updated untitled text 1. So let's take a look at untitled text 1, updated a second ago. It says almost done. Let's run our code. Works as expected. Ooh, are we going to test our luck and try to download content? Test. What's it called? Export content. Has no attribute path. Ooh, Domo Jupyter content has no attribute path. So in the function called export, man, don't do this in your demos. Why you do this to yourself? I'm looking for a function called export content, and then I said self.path. And self.path doesn't exist, but what does exist is self.folder. Self.folder. Oh, let's see if we can run export content. Self.path. I guess technically you need to run that again. Okay, so I should have a folder called export untitled1txt that contains the content. Now, guys, obviously it does not make sense to export into Domo Jupyter, but if I was running this script locally on my computer, I could map over all of the content in that list and download it locally onto my machine. That's actually the dream and vision. That's why this whole tutorial series exists. That's a lie. The real reason this whole tutorial series exists is to introduce you to a lot of the learnings that I had while I was going through building this notebook. I think writing Python is, it's one of those things where you're like, oh, I'll just do a, boot camp, and all of a sudden I know all the things. And then you're like, I know all the things, but I really wish I had somebody who had some code that works. And then you go to Stack Overflow, and everybody has a different way of doing things. And then you're like, I have to write my first library. And then you're just like, I wish I could talk to somebody about how they approached building a library. And that's what I did here, is I tried to share with you all of the things that I learned in the last 2 years about writing Python, what works, what doesn't work, and at least explain to you what I'm thinking. So if somebody else has strong opinions, they'd be like, I see what you did there, but. So maybe this will be a conversation starter about using classes and using functions and object-oriented programming to build libraries. Or at the very least, just do pip install Domo library and go forth and do great things. My name is Jay Wilson. Hope you enjoyed. Catch you later.